So obviously a huge question in Romans is, what do we do with the law of Moses? You know, the law of Moses was what defined in some ways the relationship between God and his people for hundreds, centuries leading up to the New Testament. Here comes this Jesus event, this man Jesus and the event that goes with him. And there's always this question then of, well, what do we do with the law? Because Christ comes along and says things like, you've heard it said, but I say to you. But at the same time, he also says things like, I haven't come to abolish the law, I've come to complete it. So there's this constant tension in the early Christian community. What do we do with the law of Moses? And here in chapter 3, verse 20, Paul is talking about how everybody's in the same plane. He's talking about everybody's equally sinful. And then he says, well, what about the law? What do we do with that? And his comment here in verse 20, for by the works of the law, no human being will be justified in his sight, since through the law comes knowledge of sin. He's not expressing the purpose of the law, he's expressing one of the consequences of the law. There are very few places where Paul actually starts talking about what the purpose of the law is. More often he's talking about what one of the consequences of the law was. The purpose of the law was to give the people of God a way to live under God's rule. Not the way, it happened to become the way once God gave it, but it was just a way for them to live under God's rule. But by doing that, by trying to obey God's way of living, it became very obvious, and it's very obvious to us reading the Old Testament, that over and over Israel could not possibly do it. And so whether the purpose of the law was this or not, it is the case that in trying to keep the law, Israel learned over and over that there is no way for the law to provide for their salvation because they can't keep it. Whether or not it even could, if they could keep it, it's off the table because they can't keep it. So the very experience of the law is proof to Israel that the law itself is not sufficient for salvation or for grace, because the law itself is something they could not keep. They need something more than that. And that's why Christ comes along, and he doesn't say, when we have the advent of Christ and say like Matthew 5, when he's talking about the law, Matthew 5 and 6, he doesn't say, I've come to abolish the law, because the law was a good thing. He comes and says, I've come to complete it, because the essence of the law is love God and love your neighbor. And he shows us a way to love God and love our neighbor that through the Spirit we can now actually do. So that the law of Christ and the grace of Christ is a means of salvation that the law never could be, but the reason why is not because of the law, it's not because of the grace of Christ, it's because of us. We need the grace of Christ to change.